Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen-Chi Yu. Last week, Donald Trump was formally nominated as the Republican Party's candidate for November's presidential election. His selection of J.D. Vance, a current first-term U.S. Senator from Ohio, injected new energy into the party. In the meantime, President Biden announced that he would not seek re-election and immediately endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris to represent the Democratic Party. So it's been a few very newsy weeks, to say the least. And today we're speaking to Alexander Gray, who was Chief of Staff of the White House National Security Council under the Trump administration. Let's delve into what a potential Trump-Vance administration's foreign policy might look like. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, former President Trump said in an interview with Bloomberg that Taiwan should pay for U.S. defense. What does he mean by that? How do you interpret that? Should Taiwan be worried?
I don't think Taiwan should be worried, but what I think Taiwan should be focused on is the reality that the United States, in the world that we live in, and this reality of American politics today, the United States is going to expect everyone with whom we have a substantial security obligation and a substantial security relationship to pay large amounts of their GDP toward defense if they want American support, particularly military support. And I think the reality is when you talk to average Americans who are outside of DC, outside of the political process, I think there's a wariness and a weariness with the obligations that we've undertaken since the Iraq War. And so it's incumbent on those who need and want American support to make the case for why the United States should risk our national wealth and risk young men and women who serve in our military's lives for those partners. And so one thing I would say is, you look at Israel. You look at Ukraine before the 2022 invasion, the percentage of GDP that was spent on defense, far more significant than what Taiwan is currently spending on defense.
Can you tell us roughly what numbers were we talking about?
Well, Israel is close to 10%, and Ukraine was well over 5% in the years leading up to 2022.
And Taiwan,
And Taiwan has increased its percentage significantly, and I understand that there's been an increase closer to maybe 4% or in that range. But if you are asking the United States to potentially get into a conventional conflict with our global peer competitor, you need to be spending substantially closer to what Israel spends rather than to what most NATO members spend. And I think that President Trump and most of those who would likely serve in a Trump administration are going to continue to press Taiwan that obviously we have a huge interest in Taiwan's security and it's a great relationship, but you can't continue to ask the American people to undertake these types of obligations unless our partners are willing to put substantial resources into their own defense.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's more about Taiwan needs to do more to build up its own defense and potentially more arms sales, probably. And Trump also talked about Taiwan taking away the U.S. chip business. So in your view, how will a second Trump administration semiconductor policy be different, perhaps from the Biden administration? And maybe more broadly, talk a little bit about national security and technology competition, since this seems to be sort of the front line of national security competition these days.
Well, look, I think that the Trump administration, obviously was early on supportive of the type of industrial policy that led to the CHIPS Act.
And you were very involved. Is that right? Is my understanding?
Yeah, I had the defense industrial base portfolio in the early years of the Trump administration when we identified some of our CHIPS weaknesses as being a significant challenge for not just our defense industrial base, but for the broader U.S. economy. And we saw, of course, during COVID just how vulnerable we were to supply chain disruptions and chips. And look, the CHIPS Act, I think, is a bipartisan success that has seen companies like TSMC and Intel, American companies, South Korean companies, Taiwanese companies, all taking advantage of this understanding, this bipartisan understanding that the U.S. has to have a domestic manufacturing base for semiconductors. And so I think the Trump administration is going to continue to support would be my supposition based on how President Trump governed in his first term. I would think that he will continue to support a robust U.S. domestic capability for manufacturing semiconductors. And I think that global companies like TSMC certainly have a role to play in that. And look, I think this is not just semiconductors. This is critical components across the board. We cannot be reliant on imports. We have
What are the other critical components, for example?
Well, I think like rare earth minerals, critical minerals. You look at things, you look at energy. I mean, we have to be able to have a domestic capacity, whether the company who's doing that manufacturing is a foreign domiciled company or it's an American company. They need to have production facilities in the United States for our own supply chain security and our economic security. And so I think you'll continue to see President Trump supporting the type of semiconductor policy that he did in his first term.
Yeah, it sounds like the U.S. is trying to be more self-reliant as a way to guarantee its own security, whether it's national or economic security. We want to talk about the VP candidate, J.D. Vance, as well. Lots of Taiwanese or the rest of the world are actually very curious about him because he's a relatively new face and hasn't said much about foreign policy. What, in your view, might he play a role in U.S. foreign policy? And from just your understanding, with people who are close to Trump or him, help us understand him a little bit more.
Well, Senator Vance, I think, speaks for a lot of Americans who have been deeply disillusioned by a lot of the bipartisan policies that have come out of the last 30 years of U.S. administrations. Unfettered free trade, focus on spreading democracy abroad at the point of a gun, which has led to numerous Americans losing their lives and limbs in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And Senator Vance is a veteran of Iraq. He understands this personally. And then you look at things like the opioid crisis, which has afflicted towns like the one in Ohio where Senator Vance grew up. So, there are a large swath of Americans who are very skeptical of the globalized, kind of pro-liberal economic, pro-free trade policies that have been pushed by both parties for 30 years. And Senator Vance, I think, speaks for those Americans very eloquently. He did in his book, Hillbilly Elegy. He has as a senator, and I think he
Which was a really... it has now become, there is a Chinese translation in Taiwan as well. A lot of people are now paying more attention to it now, even though it was published a few years ago. Sorry, just to note there.
Yeah, and I think reading that book will give your viewers a good sense of who he is and where he comes from. But on foreign policy, I think what he does is he speaks for people who want to focus on rebuilding our industrial capacity at home, who want to rebuild the manufacturing capacity that has been taken away by terrible trade deals over the last 30 years. I think he speaks for people who are disillusioned by 30 years of elites in Washington focusing on kind of esoteric ideas like spreading democracy rather than focusing on building U.S. industrial capacity and U.S. power at home, and has left large swaths of our country neglected. And so I think Senator Vance is going to bring the kind of sentiments of the people who he comes from to Washington. And I think he's going to be someone who's very focused on China. He's spoken very eloquently about the number one national security threat facing the United States is the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think rather than allowing our foreign policy to diverge into kind of non-core national interests. I think what you'll see is Senator Vance serving as a very powerful voice for the United States staying focused on our paramount national security challenge, which is the PRC.
Yeah, I mean, is it fair to frame it as sort of the rising of isolationists versus sort of the previous generation, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, who seem to advocate for a more US global leadership, getting involved in many people's business? I mean, would you say, I think isolationism is a strong word, but it seems to represent what you have just described quite well.
So I actually disagree with that. And I think President Trump, who is often called an isolationist, President Trump believed strongly in peace through strength. That's what he believed. That was his foreign policy doctrine. You can trace it in American political history back to President Andrew Jackson in the 19th century. This is the idea that we don't get involved very often because we have a core set of interests and we focus on those core interests. But when we do get involved, we get involved with overwhelming American strength and we lead the world on the issues that are most important to us. And if you notice, when President Trump was in office the first time, the United States was undisputably leading the world all across the globe in negotiations in the Middle East, in Africa, and he was leading in NATO. We were undisputedly leading the world. We just weren't leading it the way that George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush were leading.
And how would that leadership look different, right? Explain that a little bit. You mentioned leading the NATO. I'm not sure if the NATO member countries would entirely agree with that.
Well, I think if you look at the outcomes of NATO member countries, when Donald Trump took office, the vast majority of NATO countries were not spending 2% of GDP on defense. By the time Donald Trump left office, because of his leadership, almost all the NATO countries were on track to spend 2% of GDP on defense. That's leadership. And Donald Trump, if it was not for his leadership, NATO would not be prepared to play the critical role that it's played in Ukraine, resisting the Russian invasion. So look, Donald Trump is focused on very well-defined core U.S. national interests. He's not focused on spreading democracy. He's not focused on injecting U.S. military intervention in places that are outside of our core interests. But in the places where we have core interests, he's going to lead the world, and American strength and American power is going to continue to be the fulcrum that the world gravitates on. So
let's focus on that, right? You mentioned where the U.S. has core interests. Is Taiwan part of it?
Well, I think, obviously I don't speak for President Trump anymore, but what I will tell you is if you look at how President Trump governed in his first term, and you look at the way in which President Trump supported Taiwan through the high-level visits that we engaged in, through the arms sales, through the way in which Secretary Pompeo clarified our position towards Taiwan and the contact guidelines, taking away the absurd restrictions on how Taiwan can conduct itself in Washington. You look at all the ways in which we strengthen the Taiwan-U.S. relationship. I would say that shows just how seriously that we took the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And if you look at the national security strategy and the national defense strategy under President Trump, we defined protecting Taiwan as a very critical part of our national strategy.
Yeah, I think it's no secret that many people believe that during the first Trump administration, there's a lot of friendly policy toward Taiwan. And it was actually thanks to staff like you and others who firmly believe in a U.S. national interest in rooting in sort of Taiwan being secured. But we're not so sure about Trump himself. So how might a second Trump administration's policy toward Taiwan or China be different, especially considering that, a lot of people who were in the first Trump administration may not return. And these were the people who, have advocated for a very friendly policy toward Taiwan.
Well, look, I think I would disagree with a couple of those premises. Number one, staff like myself always like to exaggerate our role, and that's what staff do. We like to tell ourselves that we're more important than we are. But ultimately,
we know how important you guys are. So,
well, look, it's not my signature on the arms sales to Taiwan.
Yes,
of
course.
It's Donald J. Trump's signature. And Donald Trump was aware of every argument in favor of supporting Taiwan. And he made the decisions for why Taiwan was important to U.S. national interests and why the relationship matters. So I don't think that there's anything that's changed since he left office the last time that would change his view. I would also disagree that some of the greatest advocates of Taiwan at the highest levels of our government are people who may not return. I mean, you have people like Ambassador Robert O'Brien, Secretary Mike Pompeo, the former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, people like Russ Vought, who ran the Office of Management and Budget, Chris Miller, who was the last Secretary of Defense under President Trump, General Keith Kellogg, who's been a great friend of Taiwan his entire career. I mean, these are people who understand and know Taiwan intimately and who President Trump continues to have tremendous faith in. So I think you're going to continue to see around President Trump people who have a great sophisticated understanding of the Taiwan-China challenge and the competition in the region. And so I don't have any look. The reality is China has become more of a threat to the United States since Donald Trump left office. You look at its behavior towards Taiwan, its behavior towards the Philippines, its behavior throughout the region. You look at its economic behavior, its coercive economic behavior. The PRC is more of a threat to the global order than it was on January 20th, 2021. And so I think when President Trump takes office again, assuming he does, I think what you'll see is a similar approach towards a threat that has only grown since he last sat in the Oval Office.
And how is he or his administration, all these people that you mentioned, if they return to the government, address this kind of threat differently?
Well, I think part of the challenge is we've had 3.5 years of policies under President Biden that I would argue have taken us in the wrong direction in confronting the Chinese threat. So, I think what you're going to see is a substantial investment in U.S. military deterrence capacity to be able to return the military balance in the Taiwan Strait to one that's much more favorable to the U.S., Taiwan, and our partners. I'm deeply concerned that China is continuing to develop its naval and air and space capabilities in ways that are giving it the potential to have local dominance, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but even farther into the Western Pacific. And in the last 3.5 years, I don't feel like we have taken, as the United States, the steps we need to take to arrest that advance and to ensure that we continue to have local military dominance along with our partners. That's got to be step number one for President Trump and his team, is reversing that decline. And look, President Biden has made some positive steps in terms of regional alliance and security architecture. He built upon President Trump's successes with the Quad. He built upon some of the work we did leading up to AUKUS, the trilateral agreement with South Korea and Japan. We've seen some very positive non-U.S. but U.S. ally, Philippines and Japan working together to build their own security partnership. I mean, these are things that are positive and show the bipartisan trajectory of U.S.-Asia policy over the last 15 years. What I would like to see, and I hope we'll see, is President Trump expanding on all of those security architectures. Just like he was very dynamic in terms of how he handled the Quad and other security structures in the region. I think my hope is you'll see those just expanded under President Trump.
Yeah, I think, during the Trump administration, so much news has been focused on he himself as a personality, less so on some of the, accomplishments that you have just described. And I think it's really important for the rest of the world, or at least, for our audience to understand that in terms of bipartisan support for, regional architecture or, more defense spending, modernizing, or speeding up the U.S. defense. There seems to be bipartisan support. And so the disruption may not be as abrupt as some may have worried. I do want to go into sort of the broader foreign policy issues. Is there such a thing called MAGA foreign policy, which is sort of the U.S.-centric, all about U.S. national interests, which, and not judging it, but what does that really mean, for example, when it comes to the policy towards Ukraine or what's happening in the Middle East right now? What are the true top priorities for a potential second Trump administration?
Well, I think if we look at what President Trump did in his first term, it'll give us a good sense of what he might do in the second term. I also think, you can call it MAGA foreign policy, you can call it America First foreign policy, you can call it peace through strength. There's a long tradition in American foreign policy history of a foreign policy that is rooted in core interests and is projected through overwhelming strength. And I mentioned Andrew Jackson, but Ronald Reagan was a great exponent of it. Theodore Roosevelt was a great exponent of it.
And the strength is more than military and defense. Is that right? That's economic strength as well.
Well, if you look at the very first sentence of President Trump's national security strategy, he says economic security is national security. And that's something that he, in all my interactions with him for 4 years, that's something that he believed to his core, that it is at its essence, American national power comes from the strength of our economy and the strength of our working people. And only through that can we have the military power that obviously we rely on a great deal to keep peace around the world. But look, if we're going to talk about, what does this look like in Europe? What does this look like in the Middle East? I think we can look at what peace through strength foreign policy, America First foreign policy meant in his first term. It meant containing Iran. It meant putting Iran in a box so it wasn't able to project its malign activity throughout the region. Certainly wasn't firing missiles directly at Israel. Its proxies were, for the most part, its proxies were contained. You look at the overall environment President Trump sought to create in the Middle East. It was one where the United States led. The United States was the foremost outside power in the region, with our goal being peace, stability, and using our influence to negotiate the historic Abraham Accords that brought the Arab states and Israel together, united in their desire for a peaceful region, but also united in their concern about Iran's malign activity. And so I think you'll continue to see the United States playing that leadership role in the Middle East. And I mentioned NATO. I think you'll see the United States continuing to play a substantial leadership role in NATO, with the goal of forcing NATO to be the best alliance that it can be, right? An alliance that's actually deterring our adversaries like the Russians.
So Trump's threat to leave the NATO may not be as much of a concern, would you say?
Well, look, obviously I don't speak for the president, but what I will say is the president, if you look at his actions in office, the president's goal, and he used tough language, he used tough rhetoric, but his goal was to compel NATO to be an alliance that actually served the collective security interests of Europe. And it did. And if it wasn't for Donald Trump using language that I know made people uncomfortable, but forcing through his actions and his words, NATO to actually spend the money that it needed to spend on defense, there would not be the capacity to play the constructive role NATO has played in Ukraine. And I think we should all be grateful that President Trump played that constructive role, or else I would hate to think of what the outcome right now would be in Ukraine if NATO didn't have the defense capabilities that they gained in that 4-year period.
Yeah. Well, it may not be popular, but it sounds like, under Trump, there may be policies coming that, again, may not be viewed as popular, however, will be core to U.S. national interests. Another thing I think we wanted to discuss before we leave is, the very idea of cleaning out a deep state. I'll just explain to the audience what that means. Deep state refers to military and government establishments who have long controlled government policy making in Washington, D.C. And during the first Trump administration, that was quite a concern. And to be honest, I think, caused a lot of disruptions, whether you agree or not. And will that be an issue or a concern for a potential second Trump administration?
Well, look, there are a lot of people who serve in the U.S. government as career civil servants, career officials who stay on regardless of the president, who are patriots, who don't have politics, who are just there to do what the elected leadership of our country wants them to do. But there is a minority of people who serve in our government as unelected bureaucrats who think that their job is to pursue the policies of their choice, not the choice of the American people through their elected president
officials.
And their congressman.
Yeah.
And that's anti-democratic. And so I think there's going to be an opportunity for President Trump and his incoming administration to hopefully make some changes to how we staff our government. There are currently roles that are done by unelected bureaucrats who there's no political accountability. The American people, through their elected leaders and then through the appointed leaders, their cabinet secretaries, the folks who serve our cabinet secretaries, who are confirmed by our Senate, so there's at least some democratic accountability, they have no control over some of who these people are and the roles that they hold. And so I think there's going to be an opportunity for President Trump, and I think this will benefit Democratic presidents, this will benefit Republican presidents, to make sure that there's more democratic accountability in who holds senior positions in our government, and making sure that you don't have people serving for 20 years with no accountability, pursuing policies that are not what the American people voted for. And so I hope that President Trump will have a chance to make some reforms in how we staff our administration.
Well, lastly, Project 2025 that was published by Heritage Foundation has gotten a lot of attention, but it seems like Trump himself has distanced himself from that whole platform. How should people think about it? Should we pay a lot of attention to it or not really?
Well, I think people should think about it this way. Donald Trump doesn't need anyone to tell him what to do or what to think. And he never has, and he never will. He's got great people on his campaign, like Susie Wiles, his campaign manager, and Chris LaCivita, who's his senior advisor. He's got a tremendous group of former senior officials like Ambassador O'Brien and Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Miller, Director Ratcliffe, who he can call anytime he wants for advice. He doesn't need 100 think tanks to write up a 1,000-page paper to tell him how to govern this country and how to run our country. Look, I know people involved in 2025. There's some great people involved in it. It's a good faith effort to try and make our country stronger. But I think everyone, both in the United States and abroad, should understand that President Trump doesn't need anyone to speak for him, and he's going to have a transition, and he's going to have an administration that he staffs, that he leads and directs. And outside groups that are trying to be helpful, that's great. But President Trump doesn't need. We need to be very clear. When President Trump wants the American people to know what his policies and his plans are, he'll tell them. He doesn't need an outside group to speak for him.
Yeah, I think what people are looking forward to is probably some kind of written document, right? The policy platform, at least coming from his campaign or some source. So it is out there in a very systemic and organized way. But it's good to hear from you that obviously, there are all these think tanks, conservative leaning, that are trying to create the platform for him, but don't really represent his thinking. So with
if you want to understand what Donald Trump is likely to do, I really would suggest everyone look at what he did from 2017 to 2021, because for the first time in American history, we have, the second time in American history, we have a former president running again, and you can look at his previous record and make very clear, educated guesses about what a second Trump term might look like.
Yeah. Well, with that, well, thank you so much, Alex. I personally have learned so much. Actually, your explanation of what a second Trump administration should look like has diffused some of my worries, and I hope it does the same to our audience as well. And we certainly hope to have you back. I think there's still 3 months to go. A lot will happen, but thank you again for explaining the foreign policy part so well, and take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that was excellent.